In the modern world, the bodyguard is the ultimate symbol of loyalty, a figure willing to take a bullet for the person they protect. But what happens when the protectors realize that the bullet they fire is more powerful than the one they take? What happens when the only men trusted with swords inside the palace walls decide they should be the ones in charge? This is not a hypothetical question. It is the 300-year-long, bloody, and brutal secret of the Roman Empire. The story of an elite unit created for one purpose: to protect the emperor, a unit that soon became the empire's greatest predator. This is the story of the Praetorian Guard, the secret army that assassinated its own masters. This is the life cycle of a monster, and like all monsters, it was not born, it was made. Our story begins not with the Guard, but with an assassination. 44 BC. Julius Caesar, the dictator, lies dead on the floor of the Senate, stabbed 23 times by his own friends. His adopted son Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, learned a terrifying lesson. Armies at the border are useless if you can be murdered in your own home. Augustus, now the first true emperor of Rome, vowed this would never happen again. He needed a protector, an elite force, loyal only to him. He created the Praetorian Guard. At first, they were the model of loyalty. Hand-picked from the best legions, taller, stronger, and paid 3 times more than a regular soldier. They were Augustus's personal shield. But Augustus made a crucial rule. To avoid seeming like a military dictator, he only allowed 3 cohorts, about 1,500 men, to be stationed in Rome. The rest were kept in surrounding towns. The weapon was kept unloaded. Then Augustus died. His successor, Tiberius, was paranoid and weak, and the ambitious commander of the guard, a man named Sejanus, saw his chance. In 23 AD, Sejanus convinced Tiberius that for security, the entire Praetorian Guard, all 9,000 of them, should be moved into a single massive fortified fortress inside the city of Rome. It was called the Castra Praetoria. This was the original sin, the fatal mistake. For the first time, Rome had a permanent, elite army living within its walls. The protectors were no longer guests, they were an occupying force. Sejanus had not just built a barracks, he had built a fortress that overlooked the city. He had put a loaded gun on the emperor's desk, and it would not be long before someone decided to pull the trigger. The loyal protector was about to taste blood for the first time. It was not acting as a bodyguard, it was acting as a vigilante. But the line between justice and murder is one that, once crossed, is impossible to find again. The target was Gaius Caesar, better known as Caligula. Caligula was a monster, a depraved, narcissistic tyrant who delighted in humiliating the Senate and, critically, his own protectors. He allegedly mocked the Praetorian commander, Cassius Chaerea, for his high-pitched voice, using obscene passwords to insult his manhood. Caligula had forgotten the cardinal rule: you do not mock the man holding the sword. On January 24th, 41 AD, Cassius Chaerea and other officers of the guard decided to end the madness. This was not just a coup, it was a brutal, personal act of vengeance. They cornered Caligula in a palace corridor. Chaerea struck the first blow. The others descended, stabbing the emperor over 30 times. When Caligula's wife and infant daughter were found, the guard showed no mercy. They were part of the taint. The wife was stabbed, and the baby's head was smashed against a wall. The protectors had committed their first regicide. They justified it as a tyrannicide, an execution for the good of Rome. With Caligula dead, the Senate met in a panic. They saw their chance. They began to debate restoring the Republic, to end the reign of emperors for good. But the Praetorian Guard was not finished. They realized a terrifying, simple truth. If there is no emperor, there is no one to pay them. A republic had no need for a 9,000-man private army. Their very existence depended on the throne, so while the Senate debated, the Guard went hunting. They fanned out through the palace, looking for a replacement, and behind a curtain, cowering in fear, they found the last person anyone expected, Claudius, the stammering, limping, 50-year-old uncle of Caligula, long dismissed as a fool. The soldiers, in a moment of cynical genius, did not kill him. They dragged him out, hailed him as Imperator, and carried him on their shields back to the safety of the Castra Praetoria. The Senate was furious. They ordered the Guard to stand down. The Guard responded by drawing their swords. The debate was over. The Senate was forced to confirm Claudius as the new emperor. Claudius, knowing exactly who his new masters were, immediately thanked the Guard with a massive bonus, a donative of 15,000 sesterces per man, 5 years' pay, just for finding him. This was the moment of transformation. The Guard was no longer a protector. It was not even a vigilante. It was a corporation, a mafia. A new lethal precedent was set. The Praetorian Guard did not serve the emperor. The emperor served the Praetorian Guard. They had discovered they could not only kill monsters, they could create kings. The vigilante was dead. In its place, a greedy kingmaker was born. And for the next century, the throne of Rome would be decided not by bloodlines or the Senate, but by the highest bidder in the Praetorian barracks. The Guard's new role was cemented in the chaotic year of 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors. This was the Guard's masterpiece of greed. First, there was Emperor Nero. When the Senate finally turned on him, Nero pleaded with his Praetorian protectors, but the Guard had already been bribed by his rival Galba. They abandoned Nero, forcing him to commit suicide. Loyalty was no longer a duty, it was a commodity. Next came Emperor Galba. The Guard proclaimed him emperor, expecting their payment. But Galba was old, cheap, and arrogant. He made a fatal miscalculation. He famously said, "I am accustomed to recruiting soldiers, not buying them." The Praetorians took this as an insult and a breach of contract. A new player, Otho, saw his chance. He secretly offered the Guard the bonus Galba had refused. On January 15th, 69 AD, the Praetorians acted. They marched into the Roman Forum, found the 72-year-old Emperor Galba, and butchered him on the spot. They hacked him to pieces, put his head on a spear, and paraded it back to their camp, where Otho was waiting with their money. Otho was now emperor. He had paid for the throne with cash and Galba's blood, but the Guard's power, they soon learned it, had a limit. They controlled the city of Rome, but not the entire Roman world. The powerful legions on the German frontier, loyal to their own general, Vitellius, were disgusted. They marched on Rome. Otho and his Praetorian kingmakers were defeated in battle. The Guard had learned that a legionnaire, hardened by real war, was a different beast than an unarmed politician. It was a brief moment of humility, but the lesson they learned was not to be loyal, it was to be more careful. The monster had been bloodied, but its greed was now limitless, and it was about to reach its most obscene, most infamous, and most unforgivable moment. The Kingmaker, having tasted absolute power, was about to evolve into its final grotesque form, the corrupt tyrant. The Guard's greed had not yet reached its final, most obscene form. What happens when the protectors decide to sell everything? This is the climax of the Praetorian tragedy. The year is 193 AD. The Emperor Pertinax was a good man, a reformer. He saw the rot in Rome, and he knew it started in the Praetorian barracks. He tried to instill discipline. He tried to stop their corruption. The Guard responded as they always did. On March 28th, a mob of 300 Praetorians stormed the palace. Pertinax, brave but foolish, tried to reason with them. They speared him to death, cut off his head, and carried it back to their fortress. The throne was now officially empty. What happened next is perhaps the most shameful moment in Roman history. The Praetorian Guard, the protectors of the emperor, announced that they would sell the Roman Empire in an auction. They stood on the walls of the Castra Praetoria and waited for bids. Two men showed up. The first, Titus Sulpicianus, the city prefect, went inside the camp to negotiate. The second, a wealthy and idiotic senator named Didius Julianus, stood outside the walls, shouting his bids up to the soldiers. A grotesque bidding war for the world's greatest superpower began. Sulpicianus offered 20,000 sesterces per man. Julianus, from the street, shouted, 25,000. Sold. The gates opened. The Praetorians hailed Didius Julianus as emperor. They escorted the man who had just brought them to the Senate and forced the terrified senators to ratify the sale. Julianus was now emperor of Rome, but the Guard, in its arrogance, had gone too far. When news of the auction reached the frontier legions, the soldiers were not just angry, they were disgusted. 3 powerful generals marched on Rome. The most formidable was Septimius Severus. Severus and his hardened Pannonian legions thundered toward the city. And what of the Praetorians, the elite kingmakers? They panicked. They were, as one historian wrote, no longer soldiers. They were fat, lazy palace guards, accustomed to bullying senators, not fighting real legions. Their courage, which was purely financial, evaporated. They murdered Didius Julianus, the man they had just crowned, and sent his head to Severus as a peace offering. Severus was not impressed. He summoned the entire Praetorian Guard in full dress uniform to meet him outside the city. They came expecting a negotiation. Instead, Severus surrounded them with his own legions, disarmed them, stripped them of their uniforms, and banished them from Rome on pain of death. He publicly disgraced the most elite unit in the empire. It was a humiliating end, but it was a false one. Severus knew he couldn't rule without a bodyguard. So, in the same breath, he disbanded the old Italian-based guard and immediately created a new Praetorian Guard, this time staffed with his own loyal, battle-hardened legionnaires from the frontier. The monster had not been killed, it had simply been recast. The monster had been humiliated, but not destroyed. It would fester for another century, a symbol of Rome's internal rot. But every tragedy must have a final act. A final reckoning was coming, at the hands of an emperor who would finish what Augustus had started. The Guard's final evolution was from tyrant to obsolete monster. For another century they continued to play their bloody game, assassinating emperors like Caracalla and Elagabalus. They were a permanent cancerous feature of Roman politics. Until 312 AD, a new kind of emperor had risen, Constantine the Great. Constantine was fighting a civil war for control of the empire. His rival Maxentius held Rome. And who was Maxentius's most elite, most powerful and most loyal military force? The Praetorian Guard. The Guard made its last stand at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. This was not a palace skirmish, this was a war. The Praetorians, in their magnificent armour, fought with the desperation of men who knew their time was over, but they were not facing a terrified senator or a single defenceless emperor. They were facing the battle-hardened legions of Constantine. They were crushed. The Praetorians broke, fled back to the bridge and were annihilated. Thousands were driven into the Tiber River and drowned. Constantine marched into Rome as the undisputed victor. And he was a man who learned from history. He did not make Severus's mistake. He did not reform the guard. He did not replace it. He destroyed it. Constantine the Great permanently and totally abolished the Praetorian Guard, ending their 300-year reign of terror. He was not just satisfied with killing the soldiers. He marched his men to the Castra Praetoria, the fortress womb that had birthed the monster, and he ordered it torn down, brick by brick. He had the ground it stood on sown with salt, a final symbolic execution. The protectors of the emperor were no more. This is the brutal truth of the Praetorian Guard. They were the ultimate paradox, a weapon created by the first emperor to protect himself from assassination, which then spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of assassination. They were a symptom of the disease at the heart of Rome, the disease of autocracy. Augustus, in his sphere, had created a system where one man held all the power. The Praetorians simply perfected that system. They ensured that the man who held the power was the one who paid them the most. They were not a secret. They were the inevitable, brutal, and cynical consequence of a government ruled not by laws but by the sword. They were the kingmakers, the auctioneers, and the living, breathing cancer of Rome, right up until the moment a stronger sword finally and mercifully cut them out for good.